am the director of the Ukrainian-Danish Youth House, which is a rather new civil society initiative that is supposed to create a platform for young people to engage in society and be more participant, mostly in Ukraine, but also creating ties between young Ukrainians and Danes. And normally I work in Kiev, have done so for like about a year when I was sent out just a week before the invasion. And we were also about to open our physical youth house in April, but that process has been delayed. We have just actually started the process of planning the opening this week. So we hope we will be able to, without any missiles falling upon the building, to create this space where young people can come and engage and, be creative, play music, meet each other, organize. And in the meantime, we've been kind of challenged by both the pandemic and then this invasion. So we've operated in like a hybrid format, providing activities to Ukrainians, but also now since the invasion, where I have been based in Copenhagen, we've done a lot of informational activities, cultural exchange in Denmark as well. So I have a lot of contact with the young Ukrainians in Ukraine. I still have 6 of my colleagues in Kyiv, and then also the Ukrainians that have come to Denmark. So that's my kind of starting point. So I've got like 10 to 15 minutes. I'll see if I can do this very shortly. It's a big chunk of information you'll get, but basically, just to set the historical background, like why Ukrainians have this culture and the mentality that they have, we have to look at the history. Ukraine has been is an area that throughout centuries, 1,000 years, has been thrown between empires, from the Mongol Empire to the Ottoman, between Lithuania, Poland, Russia, in different formats. It's a quite attractive area, as we've realized now. That's where a lot of food grows. It's also, has a lot of shore to the Black Sea, which makes it strategic in terms of both trade and warfare. So it's been very attractive for the different big powers in the world. And Ukraine, let's say the official, like the modern Ukraine was first time independent, more or less as it is today, in a very short period between 1917 and 1919, after a civil war that kind of like where they were kind of at the same time as the famous Russian Revolution. There was a smaller revolution inside Ukraine. And I won't go into the details, but there was a brief period of independence before Ukraine then became a part of the Soviet Union. So for, I don't even remember anymore, 80 something years, Ukraine has been a part of the Soviet Union. And of course, that is a time with little freedom of anything, basically. And it was also victim to heavy Russification, as was going on within the Soviet states. And I realized, I bet I'm talking to some Baltic states as well, so you might, or representatives from the Baltic states, so you might know it. But there was a huge focus on spreading the Russian culture and the Russian language within the Soviet Union, which means that the Ukrainian culture and language was very much like down prioritized and stigmatized, and it was something that you only would keep in your private sphere. And it was considered like uneducated and farmer-like, and as a weird dialect of Russian, for instance, the language. So there's been many years of oppression and lack of possibility to live out the culture and the language and whatever comes along. And then the Soviet Union dissolved or collapsed in 1991, and Ukraine gained its independence. It was one of the states that fell into deepest poverty after after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which means that the 90s in Ukraine were really, really dark years with a lot of the state had vanished, so there was no regulation, and since everything had been state owned, there was no one who owned the factories, there was no one who owned the hospitals anymore. Everything was liberalized, and that meant that nobody took responsibility. So for the regular people, the 90s are called the dark 90s because there was a lot of also crime, because again, who was controlling the law, and very much lack of money and facilities. Then it kind of economically caught up, and actually did quite well up into the 2000s. Um, the issue with the Ukrainian political system is that they, at the time, very much inherited like the Soviet model, and also the people who used to be high in power during the Soviet times were the ones who kind of got the power again. And you know very well probably about the oligarchy system in Ukraine, which kind of was formed when since everything was liberalized and nobody owned anything, you could go in and buy key infrastructure for very little money, which means that if very few people managed, well, the one who already had some money could go in and buy, for instance, the railways or the gas, the gas providers or something like this, which then when the economy caught up to speed, they got really, really rich and really, really influent, because with money you can buy TV channels, you can support politicians, you can do all kinds of things. So this is like an unfortunate inheritance from the Soviet Union. But people have basically, so we have these 30 years of independence now, soon 31. And during this time, the Ukrainian people has been busy in general to make a living. But in 2004, we saw the first revolution in modern times, where Ukrainians gathered broadly in what's called the Orange Revolution, where they were very frustrated with election fraud during the presidential election in 2004. And it was a nationwide mobilization of people who were gathered peacefully. And it's quite unique because it was the first time that people kind of mobilized for a democratic cause in such a great extent. They succeeded. They got a new election that then afterwards was considered free and fair. And then things continued. And then in 2013-14, there was the second revolution, the revolution of dignity, that you might also know because it's been referred to very often, because that again, it was a reaction towards a corrupt president and corrupt system. The young people wanted to go into like the European integration, to collaborate more with the other European countries, and then the president decided to agree on a deal with Russia, and people were really angry. It started with the students, as it normally does in revolutions, and a lot of young people took to the streets, and then it kind of spread across the whole country. And for months across that winter, people were demonstrating. And it turned violent because the state decided to, instead of protect its citizens, they sent in police and military to shoot at them. So in the end, during the Revolution of Dignity, 107 people were killed by public officials. So it's a huge tragedy in that sense, and it was really violent, and the center of Kiev looked like a war zone because they tried to, the unarmed civilians tried to defend themselves with cobblestones and rocks and whatever you had. But this was also really a turning point, because this was like during that revolution, a lot of things started happening. That is also good, apart from the losses, of course. So the civil society actually was mobilized. You saw a lot of new media popping up, independent media. You saw a lot of new organizations forming, political activism, the hope in the fact that you could actually change the regime. The presidents were different after they got replaced the one that they were protesting against. And you have a lot of reforms coming up. So actually, in terms of state building, we see like we actually counted more or less from 2014 only, because that's where the real reforms that kind of dealt with the old corruption system started taking place. So it's a very, very young country. 8 years, 9 years soon, since they actually started the democratization process. And since then, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened in terms of reforming the judicial system, the police, uh, all kinds of like important things. Transparency laws have been put in place. Not complete, there's still issues, but it's just to say that it's been really a very turbulent past 8 years in terms of kind of catching up to speed with the neighbor countries in Europe. And I'm going through all this because for the young people, if we're talking about them, if you if you're 30 years old today, you were born in a free Ukraine, but you've lived through a financial crisis, two revolutions, one invasion in 2014 following the Maidan revolution, the annexation of Crimea, and now a full-scale invasion. And it's a little bit more than many of the rest of us in the Nordic countries have experienced in our short lifetime. So just to set the framework of what it is that people have gone through, it's really a lot of political instability, a lot of violence, in terms of, in terms of war. Since Russia invaded Crimea and supported the war in eastern Ukraine that started in 2014, it's been military duty, of course, like obligatory for all men. And there is many people who already went to the war who are veterans. It comes along very handy right now, but 14 that people have the fighting experience from the Donbass region. But 14,000 people already lost their lives and during the first 8 years of war in Ukraine now. And there's been a lot of internal displacement, refugees. So now many people have this is the second time in their short lifetime that they have to flee war. So it's just like, it's a lot. And what it does to people is that it creates like a resilience. That's for one thing. We see that people really can handle much more than what we expect. We also see it on the way they deal with this invasion now. We see that people are not giving up. They're like, how to say, kind of cynically holding on to the only thing that's reasonable. There is a very, very strong need for freedom, because this whole heritage with even like former genocide, with what happened during Second World War, with all the oppression during the former empires that Ukraine has been under, there's a really grown up this very, very strong sense of freedom and the strong need to claim your own identity. And that's also something that flourished after the revolution of dignity, where you could see it in the culture. You can see people starting talking Ukrainian more in the streets. It's a bilingual country, we might have also seen by now, but that people take pride in their Ukrainian heritage that used to be something that was kind of like shameful or not very, let's say, very recognized. So there is now this very strong force of claiming your identity. And they have a very critical approach to the world and to things, basically, because they have no reason to trust people in power. So, and also there is, I see also, it's quite hard to let's say convince Ukrainians about anything that they don't find very likely, because like, why would they believe it? Like, we might come and talk about like some beautiful, let's say, beautiful concepts and values that sound very nice and very utopian, and they'll be like, yeah, but that's not how life is. So there's very much that attitude. And just now to wrap up, to not go too far into this, in terms of who comes to the Nordic countries, I haven't checked any statistics. I'm just basing this on what I know, and also from what I see in my work. Of course, it's mostly women, because there's universal mobilization in Ukraine, which means that any man in fighting age from 18 to 60 is prohibited to leave the country. So means it's mostly women or older men and children. And of course, as it normally is, it's often the people with more resources leave first, and more capacity. But now it's been quite some time, so we also see that a lot of people who already had connections will come, to join their families. It's One of the challenges is the obvious one of language challenges, because not all Ukrainians speak very good English. Uh, and that means that they often of course, go and meet with themselves and reach out to themselves instead of reaching out to the authorities. Like, for instance, in Denmark, we've had a lot of people who then kind of communicate with themselves and try to get tips and tricks on how to, for instance, get registered in the system, where it's all available from the state side. In Denmark, they have made websites in Ukrainian explaining the whole process, but of course they are not used to interacting with the state in the same way as we are. So they will often, it will be rumor based, and anecdotes that lead the way. So I see that as a challenge, and it's a bit hard to penetrate these kind of communication bubbles, because how do you as the state, get in and say, or if, as a city, this is what our municipality offer you. But it's definitely something that I see. And then there is this, the relationship to the state is, as I said, very different, because the state in Ukraine has not always been there for people. It's been there for the people in power and the people with money, which means that as a regular citizen, you don't interact more with the state than you need to. There is a very, very heavy bureaucracy in Ukraine. It's this ironic, let's say, dynamics that when you have a corrupt system, you put more laws and more laws and more laws, which makes it almost impossible as a regular citizen to navigate. So that means that the state is not necessarily something very positive. It's a poor country, so they don't provide super good services. It's not like the schools and the hospitals don't have a very, very high level, which means that people don't have this kind of, they don't rely on that. They rely on themselves, and they rely on the network to get by in general. And that is, of course, also a cultural shock when you come to, for instance, a Scandinavian country where the state is everywhere and it's very intrusive in your life and it knows everything and there is no way out of it. If you're not in the system, then there's nothing you can do, at least like in the Scandinavian countries, to my knowledge. And I think this for Ukrainians might be quite shocking and intimidating, that there is a state entity that keeps a complete control of you, because there's also this thing in Ukraine that due to the complicated system, people find another way, and they find an easier way that makes it possible to live with, so you don't have to spend 4 days in a queue in a office in the capital to get something solved. So there is this, which I could imagine that when you work from the city perspective, that there might be like a barrier and people are completely overwhelmed. Like, how do I deal with this? All these systems, unemployment support, how to be registered in the hospitals, all these things can be very, very challenging to get into, because there's no other easy private solution in the Nordic cities, in terms of getting in. You can't just we don't have so many private schools, we don't have so many private hospitals that kind of could make it easier for you. There is, of course, the fact that most people don't have money when they come, or they have a bit, but that is very quickly spent when you go to a country that's much more expensive. And then many places you cannot work until you're registered. I don't know how long time it takes where you are. I just know that I have a Ukrainian colleague who fled, and it took her 6 weeks just to get registered in Denmark, which means that she was not allowed to work until after the registration. And first then you can start finding a job. And at that time, your money is probably spent. So that means that, again, you're into these bubbles of self-support where you rely on other people to get by. And I also want to mention the institutional relations. It kind of comes with the state relation, that schools and education in Ukraine are of very varying quality, and it's a very top-down system, like very it's not so, let's say, pedagogically inclusive. It's very top down. It's with a lot of expectations for performing in the expected way, and it's a very competition minded society. this creates a lot of very, very talented musicians because they're kind of forced into it. But it's very kind of different with many other views that I know from that you probably also are used to working with. So they're not used to, for instance, as children, they're not used to having interactions with the teacher on an informal way. It's like the teacher says you do this and that's what you do. And the same in universities, there's also varying quality of education, which means that many people often work with something very different from what they were trained to do on paper, because maybe that education doesn't hold so much quality. They're very skilled often. Ukrainians are very, very hardworking, and they always learn whatever skills they need, and they will work much more hours than you ask them to. I myself am trying to make my colleagues go home on time. It's almost impossible. But that means that it's not so aligned, the system. Maybe you're a journalist, but you could be an IT project leader right now, because that's how life trained you, even though your degree says something else. And that could also be maybe conflictual when you then try to get into the labor market here, and your profile maybe doesn't fit, even though you have the skills, but you don't have the formal qualifications. And then in terms of, I also heard that in terms of, I don't work so much with children, but I heard a presentation from a woman working with a pedagogical aspect in one of the municipalities in Denmark. And she said that what she also saw was that the parents are maybe not, who were supposed to send their children to daycare in Denmark, they were not used to leaving their children with other people in such an institution for so many hours a day. They thought it was really intimidating. That like there might be like a cultural issue here, that maybe I think parents stay home for longer. The maternity leave is quite long in Ukraine, and then that maybe there will, like, you'll go to some daycare but not for so long, or you stay with the grandparents or something like this. But this kind of like institutionalization of the upbringing can also be quite a shock. So maybe many parents who then experience trauma and stress and what they've been through don't want to leave their children for so long somewhere where they can't control it. And of course, there is, of course, the issue with the mental health and trauma that comes from being victim of a war and having to flee. It's more than, any people should go through. And there is, of course, a lot of stress, and a lot of stress because you're all the time in contact with people back home and you don't know. And many have left their partner, their parents, their sons, God knows, maybe to fight and maybe to die. We don't know. So it's and everybody knows somebody who has been victim of some violence at this point, because now it's quite widespread. So there is that, and then there's of course the issue of how to talk about the trauma, because it's not everybody. I think it depends in Ukraine very much with your level of how to say, your level of like lifestyle. If you're from a poor region who's worked hard your whole life, maybe you don't have a language for talking about your psychological trauma. So there might also be something in terms of how to deal with this and actually go through the rehabilitation process and get the psychosocial support that you need. That can be challenging. But in general, most Ukrainians, very many, are very much looking forward to go back. So it's also a different kind of approach. It's not like a determinate move to another country. Very many are waiting to get back and marry. Very many have already left. I know people who've left again. Denmark, they were here for 2 months and now they go back to help rebuild or go home to their family or whatever. So it's also can be hard to integrate and get them to devote themselves to get into the city maybe, or get into the social life, because maybe that's not their priority. They want to go home. So that is, sorry, it's very long. It's very much to say, but I'm available for questions if there's still time.
Thank you so much, Julia. It was very, very interesting. And thank you so much for this very thorough get through of both the history, but also the culture and some of the challenges that you see from this culture meeting this Nordic culture. there's now open for questions. We do have 5 minutes, so if there is any of you who have any questions, please put them forward. And perhaps while you are thinking about that, I have one question. I was just thinking, now you have put forward some of the challenges that we see, and with us here we have around 15 Nordic cities who have worked for the last many months to try to welcome these Ukrainian refugees, and I think there's been done a lot of good things. But looking at some of the challenges that you put forward here, what would you say would be some of the things that cities can do even more of to welcome these new citizens? Perhaps hopefully it's only for a short while, but maybe it will be a longer while. So what would be some of your perspectives on how we can help and welcome these new citizens to the cities?
Yes, and I also should mention that the people I talk to are extremely grateful for the efforts being made. So now I put forward the difficult parts, but in general, people are like really, really very pleased that there are so many nice people who want to support them and support Ukraine. So in general, people are very positive and very thankful. I think that maybe like one of the most important things is to to include people in terms of hiring them, making it possible for them to work, but maybe also for even in your cities, maybe you could hire some Ukrainians who could help with this work, because then they would know it from both sides. So it's not like an outside effort. If you need a person to be the contact person or be who could quickly be trained to how the systems function or what offers you have, then if you hire one, it's like a win-win, because that person would get a chance to have a job, but also could be like a link to the other communities, because as I see it, they are very connected to there's so many, but there's very many Ukrainians who are very much in touch with each other. There's like Telegram groups popping up everywhere about then it's like Ukrainians in this little city or Ukrainians in Oslo, and then they will communicate with each other to find out. So if some of them were like collaborating directly with you, then you would definitely easier get integrated, because there's a lot of small things that people don't know. For instance, that LinkedIn is a big thing. If you look for a job, it isn't in Ukraine, and then people have to learn to make a LinkedIn profile just to kind of be attractive on the labor market, because there's a lot of really, as I said, very hardworking but also very skilled people who come with a lot of like leverage because they start working very early. So like there's a lot to win, I would say, also for the employers, if there's a flexibility in terms of speaking English at work, for instance, instead of speaking the local language. So this kind of integration, I think, would be good, that there could be some Ukrainians who could explain it to other Ukrainians. I think that would be the easiest way to get by, also to communicate all the great offers that there are.
And thank you, all of you, and thank you also, Julie, for attending our city meeting here and for giving us your insights and perspective on who it is that we are now welcoming into our countries. Thank you so much for this